They excavated beneath Al-Aqsa Mosque and uncovered a hidden treasure that in an astonishingly brief span of time propelled them like an arrow skyward, transforming them from a humble monastic organization of 9 impoverished knights, reliant on alms and donations from the pilgrims and travelers they protected, into one of the wealthiest organizations in the world and among the most influential powers in history from that day to this. They became the spearhead of the Crusades, and with their own hands, redrew the boundaries of the world and its history. Following the victory of the Muslim Seljuks over the Byzantines at the Battle of Manzikert in the late 11th century, the influence of the Orthodox Byzantine Empire gradually receded in Asia Minor. Sensing the impending threat advancing from the east, the Catholics of Western Europe grew increasingly alarmed. It became evident that the Byzantine state would not withstand the pressure for long and would be unable to shield Europe from the Eastern Front. In response to an appeal by the Byzantine Emperor Alexius I Comnenus, Pope Urban II convened a meeting with the French nobility, urging them to wage war against the Muslims in the East under the pretext of liberating Christian churches from the hands of infidels and pagans, as he phrased it. At the ecclesiastical council held in the French city of Clermont-Ferrand, he delivered a powerful and eloquent sermon, emphasizing the imperative of freeing the Holy Sepulchre, the Church of the Resurrection, from Muslim control. He promised the warriors that their journey eastward and their war against the Muslims would earn them complete absolution of their sins. Thus, religion was manipulated, laying the groundwork for what became known as indulgences, and the war was cloaked in deceptive righteousness so as not to conflict with the peaceful and tolerant essence of Christianity. He branded it a holy war. His call successfully ignited the ambitions of nobles and princes who coveted the wealth of the East, while also stirring the masses who rallied under the banner of religion in hopes of salvation. They stitched the cross onto their garments and prepared themselves for war. In this manner, Urban II sparked the flame of the First Crusade with a declared aim of restoring Christian control over the Holy Lands, though beneath that lay political, colonial, and economic motives. At the same time, Pierre l'Ermite, Peter the Hermit, riding on his donkey, traversed the lands, calling upon the people with his persuasive oratory and charismatic presence to join the sacred campaign. He personally led one of the 5 assembled armies, composed largely of common folk and peasants. Thus, the campaign came to be known as the Crusade of the Poor. To fully grasp the context, one must understand that Europe at that time was immersed in what is known as the Middle Ages, the era that bridged the ancient classical period and the modern age. Spanning from the 5th to the 15th century, the Middle Ages were characterized by the dominance of feudalism, whereby nobles held vast expanses of land and exercised ownership over the people who lived on it. They were known as serfs, meaning slaves of the land. So the vast majority of Europeans were deprived of education and endured dire economic conditions and an exceedingly poor standard of living. Amid such hardship and prevailing ignorance, it was easy to instill any ideology into the minds of the masses, even under the guise of religious doctrine, to serve worldly ambitions and inflame blind fanaticism. European society was starkly stratified, with the knightly class situated in the middle. Thus, bearing arms became a necessity for survival in such harsh and precarious conditions. Meanwhile, the clergy reigned supreme as the spiritual authority, and the possessions of the church were at times equal to or even exceeded those held by kings and princes. Before the campaign began, all participants swore fealty to the Byzantine emperor, pledging to surrender any lands they might seize from the Muslims to him. Under the banner of the cross, The armies marched toward Asia Minor, defeating the Seljuks, who at the time were entangled in internal conflicts. Following a prolonged siege of Antioch, the Crusaders succeeded in capturing it, then continued their advance along the Levantine coast toward Jerusalem, which was under Fatimid rule, and they laid siege to the city. In July 1099, they succeeded in conquering it and unleashed a massacre of horrifying savagery upon its inhabitants. Accounts tell of horses wading through blood and the death toll reaching 100,000, comprising Muslims, Jews, and even Eastern Christians, according to some sources. Yet rather than honor their oath and return the city to the Byzantine emperor, they betrayed their vow and established 4 Crusader states: Edessa, Antioch, Tripoli, and Jerusalem, the latter declared the Kingdom of Jerusalem. After that, they erected settlements and extended invitations to Europeans to immigrate and settle there. Thus, the serfs, once bound to the land, became its owners, and the paupers of yesterday turned into lords. Baldwin I was crowned king of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which remained under Crusader rule for nearly a century, despite being encircled by the Islamic world. However, that Islamic world was then a fragmented and ailing entity divided between 2 major rival powers: the Sunni Abbasid Caliphate, with its capital in Baghdad, and the Shiite Fatimid Caliphate, based in Cairo. This was compounded by the complacency and apathy of Muslim rulers, who failed to unite or effectively resist the Crusaders. Thus, the First Crusade prevailed. The Crusaders captured Jerusalem, expanded along the Levantine coast, and seized Nablus, Baisan, Tiberias, Haifa, Arsuf, Acre, Tripoli, Sidon, Beirut, and many other cities. They even attempted to take Aleppo, laying siege to the city. Though the city withstood the siege, its Seljuk governor, Fakhr al-Mulk Radwan, opted for appeasement and submitted to the Crusaders in a bid to safeguard his own position and estates. So much so that he ordered a cross to be erected atop the dome of Aleppo's Grand Mosque, complying with the demands of the Prince of Antioch, Tancred. Public outrage erupted in response to such practices, and the protests were led by Judge Abu al-Fadl ibn al-Khashab, who later traveled to Baghdad to seek military support from the Abbasid Caliphate. Consequently, the Emir of Mosul, Sharaf al-Din Mahmud, marched at the head of an army toward Aleppo and succeeded in lifting the Crusaders' siege. He then proceeded to Damascus at the request of its Emir, Zahir al-Din Totakan, to aid its people against the assaults launched by the Kingdom of Jerusalem. There, he confronted the forces of Baldwin I in the Battle of Al-Sanabra, south of Tiberias, where Sharaf al-Din Mahmud secured the first significant Muslim victory over the Crusaders. Yet, treachery swiftly claimed him, as he was assassinated by a member of the esoteric sect known as the Assassins. This was an Azari Ismaili Shiite faction founded by Hassan al-Sabah, who forged it into a dagger poised against the back of the Islamic world, relying on betrayal and political assassinations to eliminate their adversaries. Not long afterward, the assassins also murdered Abu al-Fadl ibn al-Khashab in Aleppo, and following the death of its emir, Fakhr al-Mulk Radwan, he was succeeded by Alp al-Din Arslan, who was soon slain by one of his own servants. In Mosul, Emir Izz al-Din Masoud died and was succeeded by a vigorous young prince who would herald a new era in the resistance against the Crusaders, Ahmad al-Din Zengi. He hastened to Aleppo and forged an alliance with it, thus uniting Aleppo and Mosul into a single force that would later rise as the principal bulwark against the Crusaders, until it ultimately vanquished them. At that time, Baldwin I, king of Jerusalem, had died, and he was succeeded by his cousin Baldwin II. The prevailing political instability in the region cast a dark shadow over security. Although the Crusaders maintained a firm grip over Jerusalem itself, the rest of the occupied territories teemed with bandits, and Christian pilgrim caravans were frequently assaulted, plundered, and slain. It was in this climate that a French knight named Hugues de Payens met with Baldwin II and proposed the creation of a monastic military organization tasked with safeguarding the European pilgrims and travelers visiting the Holy Land. Yet this stated mission was but a facade for another, more clandestine objective: the excavation of sacred relics, a practice widespread in that era. However, unlike others who dug haphazardly in the hopes of stumbling upon treasure, their efforts were methodical and purposeful, as if they sought a specific, long-hidden artifact. Baldwin II approved the proposal, and in the year 1120, the organization was founded by 9 knights as an extension of the Organization of Malta or the Knights Hospitaller, which had been established either in 1050 or 1099, according to differing sources, by Italian merchants as a charitable institution to aid Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land, akin to the Knights of St. John. Originally established as a charitable organization, they gradually evolved into a military religious order, combining medical missions with combat roles against Islamic forces. The new organization established its headquarters atop the Temple Mount within the Al-Aqsa Mosque, a site referred to by Jews as the Temple of Solomon. From this, the members dubbed themselves the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, later known more succinctly as the Knights Templar. Not long thereafter, Baldwin II passed away and was succeeded on the throne of the Kingdom of Jerusalem by his son-in-law Fulk. Following Fulk's death, his eldest son, Baldwin III, ascended the throne. Meanwhile, Imad al-Din Zengi, having succeeded in uniting Mosul and Aleppo, sought to annex Damascus. However, its ruler, Main al-Din Anar, who had succeeded Zahir al-Din Totakan, rejected Zengi's ambitions and aligned himself with the Crusaders. Thus, in the year 1144, Zengi turned his attention toward Edessa with the intention of reclaiming it. The Crusader ruler of the city, Jocelyn, responded by strengthening its fortifications and resolutely preparing for its defense. To outmaneuver him, Zengi devised a clever stratagem, feigning an expedition against the Kurdish tribes of Diyarbakir, who had refused to align themselves with him. Jocelyn was deceived by the ruse and, believing the threat had passed, relaxed the city's defenses and departed for France. Upon hearing of this, Zengi swiftly descended upon the city, launching a sudden assault. He succeeded in liberating it after 42 years of occupation, making Edessa the first Crusader state to fall and igniting the spark of the Islamic awakening and a revival of the spirit of jihad. Imad al-Din Zengi was hailed as a hero, a beacon of hope upon whom many pinned their aspirations for the recovery of Jerusalem. Yet fate did not grant him time. Treachery reached him as he slept, and he was murdered by his servant. Some say loyal to the Crusaders, others claim he belonged to the assassin sect. Zengi was succeeded by his son, Nur al-Din Mahmud, a young man steeped in asceticism and pious devotion. He adopted jihad as his life's mission, walking in the footsteps of the earliest Muslims. He labored to ensure that the Islamic awakening was rooted in intellectual revival, summoning scholars and jurists and establishing a comprehensive renaissance grounded in the propagation of jihad in the path of God, as the sole means to reclaim the land and elevate the word of truth. The fall of Edessa sent shockwaves throughout the Christian world. In response, Pope Eugenius III and Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, the French abbot and nephew of one of the original 9 Templars, called for a second crusade. King Louis VII of France and King Conrad III of Germany, along with numerous nobles, answered the call, thus forming the First Crusade to be led by European monarchs. Yet it was a campaign lacking in clarity of vision and purpose, and its forces marched directly toward Damascus, intending to occupy it with the aim of cutting off Nur al-Din Mahmud. This proved to be a grave political miscalculation, for Damascus had maintained amicable relations with the Crusaders of Jerusalem. The siege only deepened the divisions between the leaders of the Second Crusade and the veteran Crusaders who had settled in the region since the First Crusade, further sowing distrust between them and the Damascenes. The people of Damascus, feeling betrayed, dispatched a plea to Nur al-Din, who entered the city honored and welcomed, an ally summoned by divine providence. The Second Crusade soon retreated in disgrace, leaving behind nothing but disappointment. It had, ironically, achieved but one unintended outcome in favor of the Muslims: the expansion of the Islamic front, now unified in Mosul, Aleppo, Edessa, and at last, Damascus. At that time, Baldwin III, king of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, passed away and was succeeded by his brother Amalric I. He was a shrewd, formidable, and astute adversary who quickly realized that Egypt was the linchpin of power. The one who could bring it under his dominion would surely prevail over his rivals. Egypt was then under the waning Fatimid Caliphate. The caliph's role had become purely ceremonial, confined to being mentioned in prayers from the pulpits as a nominal sovereign, while actual governance rested in the hands of his viziers. Amalric's eyes remained fixed on Egypt until an opportunity arose, when the governor of Upper Egypt, Dergham ibn Thalaba, requested his intervention in a struggle for the vizierate against Shahr ibn Mugair. Shahr, having been ousted, had fled to Nur al-Din Mahmud, who responded by dispatching his military commander, Asad al-Din Shirkuh, to support him. Shirkuh was accompanied by his young nephew, Yusuf ibn Shatsi, who was then no more than 16 years old. Shirkuh succeeded in reinstating Shahr, fortifying himself in the city of Bilbis. However, Shahr grew wary of Shirkuh's growing influence, turned against him, and treacherously summoned Amalric to Egypt. Amalric responded by besieging Bilbis for 3 months, until both parties reached an agreement to withdraw from Egypt. But Shahr once again called upon Amalric, prompting Nur al-Din to send Shirkuh once more, accompanied again by his nephew, Yusuf ibn Shatsi. This youth would one day become the sword that would sever the Crusaders' advance, the hammer that would shatter the myth of the Templar Knights in the East, after uniting the armies of Islam, earning fame across both East and West under the name Saladin. Following a series of battles and skirmishes between Muslims and Crusaders on Egyptian soil, Shirkuh finally entered Cairo. He eliminated Shahr and assumed the vizierate under the nominal authority of the Fatimid Caliph. Thus, Egypt effectively became part of the Zengid realm governed by Nur al-Din Mahmud. Upon Shirkuh's death, the Fatimid Caliph entrusted the vizierate to Saladin, who soon solidified his grip over the country despite the conspiracies woven by the power-hungry and the self-interested. King Amalric recognized the shifting balance of power in favor of the Muslims and wrote to the Vatican seeking a new crusade. Yet the monarchs and princes of Europe did not respond. Consequently, he forged an alliance with the Byzantine Emperor, Manuel I Komnenos, and together they launched a campaign against Egypt. The Crusader fleet laid siege to the city of Damietta, intending to capture it as a staging ground for a march on Cairo. Saladin dispatched reinforcements to defend the city, and the garrison of Damietta, alongside its people, mounted a valiant resistance, securing victory for the Muslims. The Byzantine fleet withdrew, followed soon after by Amalric's forces. Not long afterward, Amalric died and was succeeded by his son, Baldwin IV, later known as the Leper King due to his affliction with leprosy. After the Battle of Damietta, the rule of Egypt was firmly established for Saladin. He received a request from Nur ad-Din to cease the invocation of the Fatimid Caliph on the pulpits, and instead to invoke the Abbasid Caliph. Soon after, the Fatimid Caliph passed away, and Saladin became the de facto ruler of Egypt. He moved his family and his father Najm ad-Din to Egypt. Thus, the Fatimid rule in Egypt came to an end after 262 years, and Egypt returned to the Abbasid Caliphate under the governance of the Zengid state. 3 years later, in 1174, the Prince Nur ad-Din Mahmud passed away, and his young son Al-Salih Ismail succeeded him with Sa'd ad-Dawla Qamishtakin appointed as his regent. This led to a fierce power struggle among the Zengid princes, forcing Saladin to engage in an internal conflict to settle the matter and unify the banner of the Muslims. Amidst these events, a momentous affair was unfolding in secrecy, marking the early stages of a plan that would last over a millennium. The chapters of this plan have only been revealed by its architects, with much still hidden from the world. It appears that the leaders of the Knights Templar had finally discovered what they had been seeking, returning to France after laying the foundations for an organization that swiftly gained a reputation for its noble cause and the bravery of its warriors. They also gained a voice in the Vatican, the heart of the Christian world, embodied by Saint Bernard Delaware Clairvaux, the head of the French monastery, who had been one of the advocates for the Second Crusade and the nephew of one of the 9 knights. Bernard supported the organization with all his might, praising the nobility and courage of its knights. He even authored a book titled In Praise of the New Knight, extolling the virtues of the Templars and bolstering their growth, attempting to secure high-level legitimacy for them. His efforts were fruitful, and eventually, he secured the approval and endorsement of the Church for the organization, making the Templars a central recipient of donations and offerings. Wealth flowed to them in the form of money, land, and volunteers, to the point that noble families began sending their sons to join the Templar order, recognized by their white robes adorned with a red cross. In 1139, Pope Innocent II issued a papal decree known as the Donation of Perfection, granting the Templars special privileges, including exemption from taxes and immunity from local laws, subject only to the authority of the Pope. Imagine a group in our present time receiving a decree that exempts its members from legal authority. What could they possibly possess to wield such power and influence over ruling authorities, to the extent of being granted immunity from legal accountability? In the next part, we will continue our journey with the Knights Templar and the Crusades, exploring how they transformed into an economic powerhouse, only to collapse in a dramatic downfall.